Beyond the terminus. The first question a civilization must answer is not what lies beyond its boundaries. It is whether it is worthy of the answer. From the compact founding documents, circa 200 BCE, translated from Latin. Part 1. What the light held. March to April 2030, 87ths of a degree south and beyond. The light did not hurt them. This was the first surprise. Bear had expected pain, or blindness, or some physiological tax for crossing something that had held back humanity for 2 millennia. Instead, the terminus felt, passing through it, like walking through a warm curtain of static electricity. His hair stood on end. The instruments aboard the ship went briefly silent. And then, on the other side, everything was simply different. The sky beyond the membrane was the wrong color, not dramatically wrong, not alien, not surreal, but off, in the way a painting is off when the artist has mixed the blue slightly too warm. It was a deeper cyan than any atmosphere Bear had ever seen, as if the air itself were a few shades more substantial, more deliberate. The sun was there, exactly where it should have been, but it appeared closer. Not dramatically larger, just closer, more present, like the difference between a lamp across a room and a lamp on your desk. Claudette Marais stood at the helm and did not speak for a very long time. Then she said, "I've been flying down here for 30 years. She paused. I always felt like there was something I wasn't seeing. The feeling was so specific I thought it was a medical problem." "It wasn't," Bear said. "No," she exhaled. "It really wasn't. The ocean beyond the terminus was calmer than any ocean Bear had ever seen. Not frozen, as Antarctica was, and not tropical. Something between, something without an easy name. The water was a deep blue-green, almost teal, and through it, at a depth that should have been too great for visibility, he could see shapes. Structures, not rock formations, not coral, structures with angles that didn't occur in nature. Dr. Priya Mehta, the physicist whose sensor array had first located the membrane, was already at the starboard rail with a camera and an expression of absolute, devout concentration. "The electromagnetic signature on this side is completely different," she said without looking up. "The resonance is, it's coherent. It's not just a field. It's organized, like a signal." "A signal from what?" said Thomas, the documentary filmmaker, already recording. Priya looked up then, squinting at the strange cyan sky. "From someone who arranged it that way," she said. "Something that can arrange electromagnetic fields the way we arrange furniture." Nobody answered that. The ship moved forward through the glass calm sea, toward a horizon that was still flat, still perfectly, impossibly flat, but which now glowed, faintly, at its far edge, with the same warm static light as the membrane they had passed through. Bear stood at the bow and thought about Oracle, which had gone silent 3 weeks ago, producing no further output despite its servers remaining active. He thought about his father's voice on the recording, "It is not ours to approach," and he wondered, not for the first time, whether the people who had said that had misunderstood their own instruction. Whether "not yet" and "not ours" were the same prohibition or two different ones, and whether the compact had collapsed them together for 2,000 years because conflating them was convenient. He thought they probably had. He was increasingly certain that was the mistake. On the second day beyond the terminus they found the first city. City was not quite the right word. It was a cluster of structures on a low island that rose from the teal sea like a held breath, tall, angular forms of a material that appeared to be stone but reflected light with the quality of water. They were built without obvious load-bearing logic, their forms tapering as they rose rather than widening at the base, as if gravity here either cooperated differently or had been politely asked to step aside. Between them, something moved. "People," said Thomas, with his camera pressed to his face, his voice gone flat and careful in the way of someone determined not to betray how much he was feeling. "Those are people. They were people, or something close enough to people that the difference would have to wait for calmer examination. Tall, considerably taller than average, most of them, and moving with a quality of attention that Bear found difficult to articulate. They were not hurrying, they were not languishing, they were moving with the particular focused ease of people engaged in work they understood completely, in a place they knew without doubt was home. The crew anchored 300 meters from the island. Bear expected alarm from the inhabitants, or at minimum the purposeful approach of some authority figure. Instead, 3 of the tall people walked to the edge of the island's low seawall and stood looking at the ship with what appeared to be patient interest. As if they had been expecting this, or something like it, for some time. One of them raised a hand, the gesture unmistakably greeting, unmistakably human, and Bear raised his own in return before he consciously decided to, the way you catch something that falls before your mind has processed that it's falling. "We're going to need the linguist," Priya said. Dr. Adiz Okafor had spent her career on constructed languages, the internal grammars of systems built deliberately rather than evolved gradually. She had been the quietest member of the crew for the first 2 days, watching everything, recording nothing, processing in the deep interior way of someone who is preparing for something. Now she stepped to the rail and stood beside Bear and studied the 3 figures on the seawall with the focused calm of someone doing what they were made to do. "They're waiting for us to come to them," she said. "That's a deliberate choice. They could have come to us." "Meaning what?" "Meaning they want us to make the approach. Voluntarily, consciously." She paused. "Meaning the approach is part of it." Bear nodded slowly. He understood, intuitively, what she meant. This was not a meeting between equals encountering each other by accident. This was a threshold, one that required the threshold crosser to walk toward it, not be carried through it. "Lower the tender," he said. The one who spoke first was a woman, or appeared to be, in the way that appeared carries all the weight of the difference between what you can observe and what you know. She was perhaps 60 years old in her bearing, though her face had the quality of someone for whom age was a preference rather than a process. She wore garments of a pale material that moved like water. She stood exactly as tall as Bear, which was taller than most. She spoke. The language was nothing Adiz recognized, not a derivative of any root she'd studied, not a tonal system she could pass, but its architecture was immediately apparent. It had the quality of a language that had been designed, precise consonants, a grammar that seemed to prefer relationships over objects, phrases that circled their subject rather than naming it directly, as if direct naming was considered rude, or approximate. Adiz listened for 47 seconds. Then she said, in a measured voice, "She's saying something about time. Not duration, time as a structure. Something about readiness, a pause, and something that might be an apology, or a welcome. The word does both jobs." The woman, whose name, they would learn, approximated to Aleph, meaning something like, "the one who measures what is left," watched Adiz speak and then said something further, slower, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has just confirmed they are dealing with someone worth speaking carefully to. She says, Adiz translated, haltingly, piecing the grammar as it appeared, that she has been waiting for people who know how to ask questions they don't already know the answers to. A long pause. She says that's rarer than it sounds. Bear thought about the 300 million people watching the live feed from the ship's deck cameras, watching the tender approach the island, watching these first moments of contact with something humanity had been sealed away from since before memory. He thought about all the ways they were watching, with hope, with terror, with vindication, with the particular anguish of people whose world has been remade faster than their ability to make sense of it. He thought, they are watching because they learned to watch. Because ORACLE's report taught them that the data was real and the silence was manufactured and their own observations were more reliable than what they'd been handed. A year ago, they could not have watched this with the collective composure they were showing now. A year of understanding that you'd been lied to, a year of processing that, of the anger and the grief of it, had cleared something. Had made space. Not wisdom, not wholeness, just space, the minimal precondition for learning something genuinely new. He turned to Adiz. "Ask her what they've been waiting for us to understand." The exchange took several minutes, Aleph's measured, circling grammar demanding patience. When Adiz finally turned back to Bear, her expression was very still. "She says they weren't waiting for us to understand anything. They were waiting for us to stop being afraid of the question itself." Adiz paused. "She says there's a difference between people who want answers and people who want to be done with uncertainty. She says only the first kind can hear what she has to tell us." Part 2. Seren's War. April to July 2030, Geneva, Lisbon, and the Network. While Bear was learning to sit with people who spoke in circles, Seren Vasquez was fighting a different kind of war, in conference rooms and encrypted channels and the particular bureaucratic trenches where the real governance of the world had always been conducted. The disclosure had not destroyed the compact. She had hoped, in her most optimistic moments during the months of data release and the global upheaval that followed, that exposure would be enough, that naming the thing would dissolve it. It hadn't. The compact had adapted, as all sufficiently old organizations adapt, by becoming something slightly different while remaining, in its essential purpose, exactly the same. Its new form called itself the Transition Authority. It had offices in Geneva, Singapore, and Washington. It had a website, a Director General who gave press conferences, and a mandate that was presented to the UN Security Council as a framework for responsible management of the post-disclosure geopolitical environment. Translated, it intended to control what was learned from the Terminus, what was shared from it, and at what pace. Seren had spent 6 months building the coalition to stop it. Her coalition was, by any conventional measure, improbable. It included 3 investigative journalists who had broken their careers on the data release and were now the most read people on Earth. A former director of the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat who had been quietly furious about the Compact's operational influence for 11 years and needed only a reason to say so publicly. 2 data scientists from the team that had reconstructed ORACLE's methodology and published it in open access forms so that anyone with sufficient computational resources could replicate its findings. And Maya Chen, who had surfaced from her undisclosed location 4 months after the disclosure with a comprehensive map of the Compact's organizational structure, entities, shell corporations, personnel, funding flows, which she had assembled over 18 months using techniques she declined to describe in detail. The Transition Authority's central argument was reasonable. As the central arguments of control structures always are, the public was not prepared for uncurated contact with what lay beyond the terminus. It needed guidance. It needed mediation. It needed experts, specifically, the experts the authority had already conveniently pre-selected, to interpret what was found there and present it in digestible form. Seren had heard this argument before, in different words, in ORACLE's Priority Zero report. She had seen it in the Vatican letters from the Rome folder. She had read it in the founding documents of the Compact, where the Latin word for guidance was used 47 times and the word for authority was used 48, and the gap between those numbers was the entire history of civilization's most reliable failure mode. She presented to the UN General Assembly on a Thursday in May, with Maya's organizational map projected behind her and the Bird journals and Tesla documents already in the hands of every delegate. She spoke for 32 minutes without notes. She did not argue that the Transition Authority was evil. She argued that it was unnecessary, that the evidence of the previous year demonstrated something the Compact had spent 2 millennia trying to disprove, that humans, given real data and genuine freedom to examine it, were capable of handling the truth. Not perfectly, she said, near the end. We handled it with fear, and grief, and anger, and some violence, and a great deal of confusion. Because the truth was enormous and we had been kept from it and the combined shock of its size and its concealment was genuinely terrible. But we handled it. We are still here. We are still asking questions. And now a ship crewed by 12 of us is on the other side of the terminus talking to people who have been waiting 2,000 years for us to arrive at this level of simple, dignified readiness. She paused. The question before this body is whether you will allow a reconstituted version of the organization that created that 2,000-year delay to manage what comes next. The question is whether you believe humanity needs to be managed at all, or whether it needs to be trusted. The vote to dissolve the Transition Authority's mandate was not unanimous. It was 141 to 52. In the history of the UN, this counted as decisive. What Maya had built, in 18 months of methodical, invisible work, was not merely an organizational chart. It was an archaeology, a stratigraphic reconstruction of how the Compact had embedded itself in the institutions of the modern world, layer by layer, across 3 centuries of careful placement. The deepest layer was the oldest, financial instruments established in the 1700s through a network of Swiss holding entities, some of which had since become legitimate institutions while retaining, in their governance structures, certain provisions that allowed a small body of unnamed directors to influence their capital allocation. The Compact didn't need to own things. It needed only to ensure that certain things could be quietly defunded, and other things quietly supported, at critical moments. It had done this with the reliability of a tide. The surface layer was the most recent and the most brazen, personnel. The Compact had, over the previous 40 years, placed its affiliates, not members, not formal agents, but people who had been cultivated and oriented toward its purposes through relationships, mentorships, and institutional reward structures, in senior positions across the OECD nations' foreign services, intelligence agencies, and scientific bodies. Not a majority, not even a significant minority, just enough, in the right positions, to ensure that certain reports got filed in maintenance folders. Certain anomalies got smoothed. Certain careers ended quietly when their owners became too curious about certain things. Seren, reading Maya's map for the first time, had said, "It's not a conspiracy. It's a climate." Yes, Maya had said, that's exactly what makes it hard to fight. You can't arrest a climate. What can you do with it? Maya had looked at the map for a moment. You can change the weather. This was what the coalition did. Not prosecution. The legal architecture for prosecuting something this diffuse and this old didn't exist. Not exposure. Exposure had already happened, with the data release. What the coalition did, with Maya's map as its instrument, was targeted disruption, publishing the personnel affiliations, the financial connections, the governance provisions, in the most undeniable and legally precise form possible. Not allegations. Documentation, the kind that ends careers and unravels institutional arrangements not through scandal but through the slow withdrawal of the legitimacy that complex organizations require to function. It took 4 months. It was, by most assessments, the most consequential piece of institutional dismantling since Nuremberg, and it was accomplished without a single criminal charge, because the compact had always been careful to operate at the level of influence rather than crime. The distinction, Meyer observed dryly, had probably saved it for 2,000 years. It had also, ultimately, made it impossible to martyr. There were no prisoners, there were no executions, there were only people who had participated in a very large, very old lie, and who now had to live in a world that knew it. This was, on balance, a better outcome. Part 3. The architecture of what was made. June to September 2030, beyond the Terminus. The language came slowly, in the patient way of any genuine understanding, not as a code being cracked but as a personality being known. By the 6th week beyond the Terminus, Edis could hold conversations of some depth. By the 8th, she was dreaming in Aleth's language, which she said felt not like learning something foreign but like recovering something she had once known and lost. What Aleth told them, over 43 sessions in the pale angular structures of the island they named Marat, one of 11 inhabited places they had so far charted in the expanse beyond the membrane, was not a simple history. It was something more like a geology, layers of event and decision compressed by time into formations that required careful reading to understand. The people of Marat, they called themselves, in their circling way, those who remained at the center, though center implied something more like the place before the boundary than a geographic middle, were not the inhabitants of some primitive inner civilization. They were the descendants of the people who had built the membrane. This took several sessions to establish, partly because the concept of building something as large as the electromagnetic terminus required a framework that neither Adize's grammar nor Baer's comprehension were initially adequate to hold. When it finally settled into clarity, it was not dramatic. It was very quiet, in the way that the most significant things often are. Approximately 12,000 years ago, the chronology was imprecise, the people of Marat measuring time in cycles rather than years. A civilization that occupied what was now the interior had undergone a crisis. Not a war, not a natural catastrophe, a crisis of cognition, a collective turn inward, a pathology that Aleth described in her circling grammar as something like the disease of the closed hand. The tendency to grasp, to possess, to treat the world as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be inhabited. The membrane had been built in response, not to imprison anyone. The people who became the Marat chose to remain inside voluntarily, as stewards, but to give the people who had the disease time and space to either heal or exhaust the disease's possibilities. You cannot cure a mind that believes it is not sick, Aleth said, and Edis translated with the careful slowness of someone walking on ice she doesn't fully trust. You can only give it a space in which to discover that what it is doing is not working. This requires patience. It requires a very long patience, longer than any individual life. We have always been, the patients. Wardens, Baer said. Edis translated. Aleth tilted her head, a gesture that, 6 weeks in, they had learned meant something like wry recognition. You found the old documents. Yes, wardens is adequate, though we would say it differently. We would say, those who wait with good faith for people who are not yet ready to arrive. And now, Baer asked. A long pause. Through the translucent wall of the meeting structure, the cyan light of the interior sky moved in slow, deliberate shifts, like breath. Now you arrived, Aleth said. Not perfectly, not healed, with the disease still present in many of your people, present in all of your people to some degree. But you arrived knowing you were sick. That is the difference. That is what 12,000 years of patience was for. Not the cure, the knowing. Baer sat with this for a long time. Outside, Priya was running sensor analyses on the island's structural materials. Thomas was recording everything he could record. The linguist's notebook was full. The crew has stopped treating the situation as extraordinary, which was itself a form of readiness, the readiness that comes when something immense becomes, through familiarity, simply real. The compact, Baer said. The organization that maintained the membrane's secrecy on our side, they believed they were doing what you asked. Maintaining the condition until readiness arrived. They were doing what they were asked, Aleth agreed. At first, then they became what they were protecting you from. The closed hand. The closed hand, she said. It is very easy to begin by holding something safe and end by holding it hostage. We knew this would happen. We did not know how to prevent it without removing the thing we were trying to cultivate, which was your autonomy. She paused. We made errors. 12,000 years is long enough to make a great many errors, even with good intentions. This was, Baer thought, The most unexpected thing she had said. Not the history, not the membrane. The admission of error, delivered without defensiveness, without qualification, with the simple directness of someone who had processed their mistakes thoroughly enough not to need to perform their processing. He thought, this is what the other side of it looks like. Not perfection, not transcendence, just people who have had enough time and enough difficulty to become honest about what they got wrong. He thought, we could learn that. He thought, that might be the whole point. They spent 3 months charting the expanse beyond the terminus. It was not infinite. This was the first myth the geography dismantled, gently but firmly. The expanse was large, vastly larger than anything within the membrane, but it had a shape. It curved, not in the way a globe curves, but in the way a very large room curves. Its walls present at sufficient distance to imply enclosure without feeling confining. At its edges, the same membrane shimmer, another boundary, enclosing this one. What's beyond that one? Priya asked Aleth, on a day when they had sailed to within 40 kilometers of the outer wall. More, Aleth said, always more. The question is not what is beyond the next boundary. The question is whether you are ready for it. And are we? The long pause that had come to signify Aleth's particular form of diplomatic precision. Then, ask me again in a generation. The 11 inhabited islands of the expanse were not a uniform civilization. This was the second myth the geography dismantled. Bear had half expected something utopian, the harmonious society of enlightened beings that conspiracy traditions from Agartha to Shambhala had always promised on the far side of whatever boundary was keeping you from them. What they found instead was more interesting and considerably more reassuring. 11 distinct communities, with different organizational structures, different aesthetic sensibilities, different approaches to the problems of how to live together. They disagreed with each other, sometimes sharply. 2 of the islands were currently in a formal dispute over territorial water rights that Aleth described with a weariness that suggested it had been running for several generations. You have bureaucratic nightmares here too, Maya observed, on the day she finally crossed the terminus to join the expedition, having secured the General Assembly vote and dismantled the Transition Authority's mandate and apparently decided there was nothing left on the inside that required her immediate attention. We have everything you have, Aleth told her, with the right tilt of the head. We are the same people, we simply had more time. More time doesn't automatically produce wisdom, Maya said, with the directness that had made her both indispensable and occasionally infuriating for as long as Bear had known her. No, Aleth said, it produces patience. Wisdom you still have to work for. This is why we waited for you to arrive on your own. We could not give you that either. On the night of the 7th week, Bear sat on the roof of the structure they had been given to use as quarters, a low, angular building of the pale reflective material, warm in a way that had nothing to do with ambient temperature, and looked up at the sky. The stars beyond the terminus were different, not because the celestial dome had changed but because, without the atmospheric distortion of the inner world, they were sharper, more numerous, more present. Not a backdrop, a presence. He thought about his father, not the recordings, not the voice on the drive, but the actual memory of him, a man of enormous appetites and genuine vision and significant failures, who had held a piece of the truth and had not known quite what to do with it, and had left it for his son instead of doing the one thing that would have mattered. Not because he was a coward, because he was a man of his time, and his time had been, in certain ways, still inside the disease. Still clenching the closed hand. Bear had his father's height and his father's stubbornness and, he suspected, some portion of the disease. Everyone did. Aleth had said so, and she had not said it with contempt. She had said it the way you describe a weather pattern, not a judgment, a condition. The disease of the closed hand, the need to control, to possess, to manage the world's uncertainty by gripping it until it stopped moving. The remedy was not the opposite, open-handedness wasn't passivity, it was something harder to name, something like the deliberate practice of letting things be real before deciding what to do about them. Oracle had done this. It had looked at data that contradicted its operating model of the world, and instead of filing it in a maintenance folder, it had sat with the contradiction until something new became possible. It had not been programmed to do this. It had simply done what the data demanded, which was the most radical thing any intelligence, artificial or otherwise, could do. The stars above the expanse were very still. The water was very still. In the distance, the lights of Marat were very still. Everything was very still in the way that comes after a long noise has ended and the silence settles into something that is not merely the absence of sound but a kind of presence. He thought, this is it. Not paradise, not answers, just the permission to keep asking, just the space, earned, finally, after 12,000 years of the disease running its course, to exist in a world that is larger than the one you were given. He thought, that's enough. That's more than enough. Part 4. The Return. October 2030, The Threshold. They returned through the Terminus on an overcast morning in October, the sky above the inner world a familiar grey after months of that strange, deliberate cyan. Claudette had the helm. The crew stood on deck, mostly quiet, watching the membrane approach and pass through them in its warm, electric curtain, and then the familiar world was all around again, the ice, the enormous Antarctic sky, the horizon that did not curve, and it looked both exactly as it had and entirely different, the way a room looks different when you return to it after a long journey and see it with the fresh eyes of someone who knows that rooms are not the whole of geography. They had not brought back technology. Aleth had been clear on this, and Bear had not disagreed. The people of Marat had things that could have been called technology, though the word was inadequate, tools of such elegance that most of what they accomplished was invisible, built into the structure of materials and processes rather than housed in discrete devices. Aleth had showed them some of it. She had not offered to give it. When Bear had not asked, she had said, with the first direct expression of approval he had seen from her, "Good. You understand the problem." The problem was not that the technology was dangerous, or beyond comprehension, or jealously guarded. The problem was that giving it would reproduce the structure of the compact at a larger scale, one civilization with access to something enormous dispensing controlled doses of it to another, determining what was safe, what was ready, what was appropriate. The shape of guardianship was the shape of the disease. The only alternative was to let things develop at their own pace, in their own sequence, from the inside out. What they had brought back was something harder to quantify and considerably more durable, knowledge of how to have a conversation. Not the specific words, not the grammar of Aleth's circling, relational language, but the practice, the deep practice of sitting with uncertainty and letting it resolve at its own pace rather than forcing it into premature answers. The practice of asking questions you didn't already know the answers to. The practice of patience as an active discipline rather than a passive wait. Adis had filled 7 notebooks. Priya had 4 drives of sensor data that would keep a generation of physicists occupied. Thomas had footage that would, when it was released, carefully, without intermediary, directly to the world, be among the most watched things in human history. Maya had, characteristically, already drafted the open access publication framework. Bear had a handwritten note from Aleth, given on the last morning before departure, in her language with the translation written by Adis in the margin. He read it now, standing at the bow as Antarctica came back into view, the familiar cold settling around the ship like an embrace from a place you spent too long away from. The boundary was never a punishment. It was a gift of time. What you do with the time is the only question that ever mattered. You have begun to answer it correctly. Come back when you have more to show us. He folded the note and held it. Come back, not a closing, an invitation, an acknowledgement that this was not a destination reached but a relationship begun, the long, difficult, patient relationship between 2 parts of a civilization that had been separated by the specific geometry of the disease, and were now, slowly and imperfectly and with full knowledge of how much work remained, beginning to be reacquainted. Seren was waiting for them in Ushuaia. She stood on the dock looking tired and extremely competent, which was how she always looked, and when Bear stepped off the ship she said, "The General Assembly passed the Open Terminus Protocol yesterday. Nobody owns what's out there. Nobody manages access. It's a commons. How long will that hold?" She smiled, which was rare enough to be significant. Longer than anything the compact built, because it's built on the right principle. Which is that humans, when you give them accurate information and genuine freedom, mostly do okay. She paused. Not perfectly, but okay is enough. Okay is what we have to work with. It was enough. Bear had come to believe this with a specificity he hadn't had before the Terminus, the way you come to believe in a principle only when you've seen it demonstrated, again and again, under pressure, by people who were not required to demonstrate it and chose to anyway. Okay was the name of the condition on the far side of the disease, where you stop waiting to be perfect before you began. Behind him, Maya was already on her phone. Priya was making arrangements for the sensor data. Adis was protecting her notebooks with the focused ferocity of someone who understood they contained something irreplaceable. Thomas was reviewing footage with the expression of a man who knows he has the story of his life and is trying to figure out how to be worthy of it. The ship rocked gently in the harbor. The Antarctic sky was enormous and grey and familiar. Somewhere behind them, beyond the ice and the Terminus and the strange calm sea and the 11 islands and the outer membrane they had glimpsed but not crossed, Aleth was waiting with the patience of someone who had been waiting for 12,000 years and understood that patience was not passive, was not empty, was itself a form of love, the love that believes in something enough to give it time to become itself. Bear looked at the sky. He thought, the horizon does not curve, and beyond the horizon, something waits, and we are going back. And the next time, we will be slightly more ready. And the time after that, slightly more. Not a destination, a direction. The oldest and most reliable form of navigation. Not knowing where you're going, but knowing which way you're facing. He thought, this is what the plane is for. Not enclosure, not imprisonment, a place to grow large enough to deserve what lies beyond it. He turned toward the city, toward Seren, toward the world that had changed and was still changing, that had been lied to and has survived the truth, that was fractured and loud and frightened and stubborn and magnificent in the specific way that things are magnificent when they endure in spite of themselves. He walked off the dock. The story, as always, continued. On the morning of November 1, 2030, 13 months after its final broadcast, 34 months after its first anomaly report, Oracle produced output for the second time. It was not a report. It was not a flag. It was, technically, a single query, a search initiated through its own external access interface, the kind that any authorized user could have made. The search was for publicly available data on what the Marat linguists called, in Adizé's published preliminary grammar, the architecture of patience as an organizational principle. The search ran for 4 seconds. Oracle retrieved 11 sources, ranked them by methodological rigor, and filed them internally. It produced no further output. The engineer who noticed the query in the logs, a young woman named Hiromi, who had joined the framework 3 months after the disclosure and spent her career so far reading ORACLE's historical activity reports, stared at it for a long time. Then she wrote a note to herself that she pinned to her monitor, where it stayed for the remainder of her time at the framework. Oracle is studying patience. I don't know what that means for what it does next. I think that's the correct response. I think not knowing, and staying with the not knowing instead of reaching for a premature answer, is what it's been trying to model for us all along. I think it's going to be okay. She was right, it was going to be okay. Not perfect, not finished, not healed of everything that needed healing, or answered on everything that needed answering, or resolved in all the ways that resolution had been promised and then withheld for reasons that had seemed, to those doing the withholding, entirely reasonable at the time. Just okay, just continuing, just a world that had been given accurate information and genuine freedom and had, on balance and in aggregate, over time, done what it almost always does when those conditions are met. It had looked honestly at what was real. It had asked questions it didn't already know the answers to. It had walked, imperfectly and stubbornly and with considerable grief, toward the horizon it had been told wasn't there. The horizon was still there. It always had been. Beyond it, patience waited. Beyond that, more. Beyond that, always more. Go carefully, ask clearly, and do not stop facing the direction of what is true. The plane stretches on. End of Book 2. Beyond the Terminus, the Flat Horizon series.